Thank you very much. Dobry den. Good morning. Very nice to be here, and I hope you can deal with me talking in English for the next 45 minutes or so, because my Slovak is very poor. Salesmanship, showmanship, and fame is my title. And okay, let's start. I used to work in advertising. That's how I got into this business. I joined an agency in 1974 in London called Bose Massimi Pollitt. It used to look like this, next door to Paddington Station. I was really lucky. It was a fantastic agency. We did advertising that was not only admired within the advertising industry, but much more importantly, it was popular with real people in the real world. And it was also, on the whole, very successful. And I had a very enjoyable time there. It later on became part of the DDB network, and I continued to work there after that, and that also was terrific. But that was different. So particularly when I started, and for the first 15 years or so, Bose Massimi Pollitt, BMP, was an agency that did the kind of work that in those days I think we all wanted to do. Probably the most important single creative guy in terms of delivering that work was a man called John Webster, who you may well have heard of if you're in the advertising business. And if you haven't, but you're interested in advertising, it's well worth looking him up. There are some very interesting films about him that you can find online. And this is a picture of the great man, John Webster himself. What may not be so obvious is that this young man in the corner with a glass of wine in his hand and a cigarette in the other is myself, just to prove that I was really there. Now, the sort of work that John did, I mean, there are so many famous campaigns which are very famous still in the UK, not necessarily well known elsewhere, although you may well have heard of campaigns like the Smash Martians. But I just want to start by showing you an example of the sort of advertising that John did and that we did, by showing you just one commercial. And then I'm going to talk about that as a basis for the different ways that we can think about how advertising and how advertising works. So this is the commercial.
Susie's going to sing about a different kind of chocolatey biscuit.
Trio!
Too loud.
Trio!
I said that was too
I
loud.
want a trio and I want one now.
Yeah, well, we all do, man, but listen.
Not one, not two, but three things in it.
I said-
a chocolatey biscuit and a toffee taste too.
Listen, could you just cool
And
it?
not one.
No three things are quite as good together as a trio.
So this is not John's most famous campaign. It's one of my favorites, because I think it's very charming. It's very funny. Clearly, if you haven't seen it before, it's for a chocolate bar. It's featuring a character called Susie who's singing too loud and singing the name of the product, which is Trio, etc. Now, how do we make sense of an ad like this? We can think about what does it tell us, and we can think about what it's also showing us. And then we can begin to think about maybe how does this ad work? How does it achieve its results? So what does it tell us? First of all, it's a very communicative ad. It tells you exactly what this chocolate bar is like. You see it, it's described, it's got three things in it: toffee, biscuit, chocolate. That's all very straightforward. And that's quite important, because otherwise you wouldn't really know what it was talking about. So I think that's the kind of the base level. But what else is going on here is much more important, which is, what do we see? Well, first of all, we see a cartoon. and we see an animated cartoon with 3 characters, and there's a drama going on where, something happens, and Susie is singing too loud, and the others are complaining it's too loud, and they end up sticking the bongos in her mouth. So there's a bit of a story going on. And there's music, there's a song, and also it's a song that people watching this ad would almost certainly have known, and you may well know it even now, but it's actually riffing off a lot of things that are already out there in the public. I mean, to start with, it's parodying a song from 1956 by the calypso singer Harry Belafonte, which was actually a rather grim work song from Jamaica about loading banana boats, which went day-o, day-o, and they're riffing off that. Now, that came out in 1956. It was a big hit. Within a year, this guy, who was Stan Freberg, who was an American comedian, did a parody version of it in which somebody was trying to sing the banana boat song, and another guy who was a sort of beatnik type who was playing the bongos kept saying, "Too loud, man, my ears. Can you make it quieter?" I haven't got time to play all this now. It's quite entertaining. Look it up if you're interested. Stan Freberg's Banana Boat Song. And the point is that John's ad does not come out of nowhere. He's using something that already exists and already may well be known to the audience. I mean, it works whether or not you know that background. But the point I'm making is that everything we see in this ad is totally a part of popular culture. It is using humor, it's using all the modes of entertainment. And that, I think, is something that throughout my career I found was somehow, although we did it, we never talked about it. It was like a dirty word to talk about advertising being entertaining, or the fact that it uses all the devices of popular culture and popular entertainment. So that, I think, increasingly began to fascinating me, and in the recent years it has led to me writing these 2 books on the subject, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So how did we get into this situation? I want to explain it by saying there are 2 particular ways that we can think about advertising. One is to see advertising as salesmanship. The other is to see advertising as showmanship. Now, these are 2 very different traditions. The word salesmanship goes back a long way, as I'll show in a moment. The word showmanship, as applied to advertising, I'm not sure anybody had ever used that word until I did in The Anatomy of Humbug in 2015. I mean, if they did that, it was great. But on the whole, people didn't talk about advertising in those terms. And that was what fascinated me. So I think for a very long time, the dominant tradition of how we think about advertising can be summed up by this word salesmanship. Now, where did that come from? Well, it goes back a very long way. It goes back to about 1900. And there's a famous story of how Albert Lasker, who ran a very important advertising agency in Chicago at that time, was met a guy called Johnny Kennedy, who was a freelance copywriter, who said, "I can tell you what advertising is." And he said, "Advertising is salesmanship in print." Now that became hugely influential. Lasker took that totally on board. He designed his whole agency around it. He became very successful as a result. He later went on to hire Claude Hopkins, who wrote an even more influential book in the 1920s, which was really about how advertising is all about salesmanship, how it sells, and it sells by giving information. What did selling mean in those days? It meant a very sort of linear process. There were already sales manuals that said to sell you must get attention, create interest, then create desire, then close that sale. You're probably familiar with this, but that was already around in the 1890s. The theory of salesmanship was then updated in the TV age about 50 years later by Rosser Reeves, who consciously updated, a big fan of Claude Hopkins, who said, advertising is the art of getting a unique selling proposition into the heads of the most people at the lowest possible cost. Again, phrases that we're very familiar with, but maybe didn't know where they came from or took for granted why they're important. So there are various versions of salesmanship, but they all have these things in common. The salesmanship model suggests that an ad must, first of all, has to get conscious attention from the prospects. And then it delivers a message. It delivers a rational sales message. And that's often described as a proposition or a benefit, plus maybe some support, a reason why. All this language comes from people like Kennedy and Hopkins and Rosser Reeves. And then there's a sort of added bit which really Rosser Reeves brings in, which it must then lodge in the memory. This is a very active-passive model of how advertising works. It's like, I am going to get this message into your head. And I think you can see in this 1930s advert from Young and Rubicam how they interpret that. You know, advertising must have impact. It must punch you in the face. And that's the way you get that message into people's heads. It's quite aggressive, invasive, and one-to-one. Another corollary of this salesmanship theory is that the people who talked most about it very much wanted to distance it from any sense that advertising was about entertainment. Entertainment becomes a dirty word. Claude Hopkins says in his book, don't treat your subject lightly. Don't lessen respect for yourself or your article by any attempt at frivolity. People do not patronize a clown. So there's humor out. And then David Ogilvy, God bless him, says, don't sing your selling message. Selling is a serious business. So this is very characteristic of the way we think when we think about salesmanship. So as I say, over the years, there are various versions of this, and there's a sort of family tree of salesmanship where virtually all the language that we're taught when we come into advertising comes from. When we talk about sales messages, when we talk about impact and standout and attention, when we talk about recall or message recall or USPs or propositions or single-minded propositions, the language of the salesmanship models has dominated our language, it's dominated our research, and it's dominated our thinking. What about creativity, you say? What about the creative revolution? Well, actually, even Bill Bernbach was part of this salesmanship tradition. He was quite keen on creativity, as you know. Whatever he meant by that, that's another question. But even Bill Bernbach fundamentally was about selling. And when you see a quote like this, I think it makes it very clear. For a speaker on advertising not to express the importance of creativity in getting attention to an ad and making the product advantage memorable. So even Bill Bernbach sees creativity as, yeah, it's quite important, but it's only there to do one thing. It's only there to get that all-important USP or sales message across. So even Bernbach is part of that tradition. The fundamental salesmanship assumptions are advertising, at the end of the day, it works by rational persuasion. You tell people why your brand is better, and they believe you. It works by message transmission. You get a thought, a concept from your head into theirs. And that gives it a very strong bias towards the important thing in the ad is information, not the entertainment. So in the case of Susie, it would see that the really important part of that ad is the description of the product. And of course, that is an important part of the ad. But I would question whether it is the most important part of the ad, or whether indeed you can really separate it from the other things that are going on in that ad. Another point about the salesmanship model, which I'll come back to later on, is that actually we take it for granted, but it very much envisages advertising as a one-to-one communication. I am the advertiser, you are the prospect, I am getting this into your head. It's that punch on the single person's face. we'll come back to challenge that, because I think there are other ways of thinking about how advertising works. So much for salesmanship. And as I say, I think this starts about 1900. So it's quite interesting. If we go back a few years before that, look at an ad like this from, say, the 1890s or so, and you think about that whole salesmanship theory, and you say, well, what about an advert like this? What is this ad doing? If advertising is about communicating a product advantage or getting a message into people's heads, what on earth is going on here? All we've got is the brand name, and we've got a lovely picture, a very colourful picture of a cute little girl and some cute little puppies, and she's going to take them and give them a bath, and she lives in a lovely house with expensive carpets and expensive furniture and pictures on the walls. I mean, there's lots of things being communicated here, but in a very subtle way. And actually, the important thing at the end of the day is probably not so much that anything is being communicated at all, as the fact that for the people who saw this picture in the 1890s, this was a really charming picture, and they would like to have a copy of it on their wall, please. And indeed, Lever Brothers would make copies of this available. It was like branded content, if you like. You can have a copy framed to put on your wall. How nice is that? So there's something very different going on here. It's not about message transmission. It's about something else entirely. And when you start to look for it, of course, that's characteristic of so much advertising ever since, in whatever era. You know, when you look at it, so much of what's going on is not about a message, whether or not there's a message there. It's about other things. It's about things that give pleasure. It's about things that seduce. It's about things that entertain. It's furry animals. It's comedians. It's sexy film stars. It's cartoons. It's absurd, people dressed up. It's nice-looking girls with long legs, whatever you see in all these pictures. It's comedy. It's cartoon animals. It's figures that have been invented that are often very childish, very playful. All the things that Ogilvy and Hopkins seem to be saying, oh, no, do not lessen respect for your product by doing that. Now, we know, in a way, or we ought to know, people have been doing this for 150 years. We ought to think that perhaps there's a reason why it works. But on the whole, people in advertising have not been very good at talking about that. So I tried to find a different language to talk about it. And when I wanted a word to contrast with salesmanship, I eventually came up with this word showmanship, which just has a nice ring to it. And as I say, not a word that we've traditionally associated with advertising. Now, I think if we look at showmanship as a tradition, it goes back actually a lot further in time than the salesmanship tradition. And yet those earlier traditions have been largely ignored or even disowned by the advertising business. So I'm going to talk a little bit about showmanship, and I might as well start here. In 1850, and Jenny Lind arrives in New York. What happened on September the 1st, 1850, is a boat from Europe appears. It is carrying Jenny Lind, the famous Swedish nightingale, a famous singer, still in her 30s. And joining her at the Verrazano Narrows on the boat, so that they're both standing on the boat visibly as the boat comes in, is Phineas T. Barnum, the great showman and impresario. Now, Barnum has organized a concert tour of the United States for Jenny Lind. He has organized 150 concerts, for which he has made it very publicly known that he's paying her a fee of $1,000 for each of those concerts. Think about that. In 1850, that's an astronomical sum of money. So just the fact of the sheer scale and extravagance of this is something that's bound to make news. And that is all part of Barnum's strategy, because he knows that if this concert tour is going to succeed, before Jenny Lind even arrives, everybody needs to know who she is, and everybody needs to want to be part of this Jenny Lind phenomenon. So, the sheer scale of the tour is part of how he promotes it. And the arrival is another aspect of this. When she arrives, they're already, the wharves of downtown New York, they are decorated with flowers and banners. There are crowds there. There are bands playing. All of this has been organized by Barnum, knowing that the newspapers will have to therefore be there and give it coverage. He doesn't have that much media to play with compared to today. He doesn't have the internet. He doesn't have television. He doesn't have radio. All he has is the press and word of mouth. But that's enough because he knows how to work it. He does stunts like he auctions some of the tickets. They sell for maybe $3, $4, $7, still a lot of money in those days. But he auctions some of the tickets, and people who just want to be famous themselves pay up to $650 for those $5 tickets. So that, again, people go, wow, that's amazing. That gets written about in the newspapers. There's a huge range of merchandise around this. I'm sure a lot of this is not authorized, but Barnum doesn't mind. Everyone wants to get into part of the Jenny Lind phenomenon. So Jenny Lind cigars, books about Jenny Lind tobacco, Jenny Lind makeup, Jenny Lind dressing dolls, Jenny Lind pianos, Jenny Lind riding habits. I mean, there's an endless list of stuff. And basically, everybody wants to be part of it. So another aspect of this fame is people literally want to buy into it. They want merch. And by selling Jenny Lind, apart from selling the tickets, people are making money by selling other merchandise on the basis of it. All of this is happening in 1850. Now, who is Barnum and why is he doing this? Well, he already has quite a reputation. He's done a lot of famous stunts. He's had Colonel Tom Thumb. He's had the famous Fiji Mermaid, which I'll show you in a moment. But basically, Barnum, born in 1810, and if you've seen the film The Greatest Showman, of course, it's very unhistorical, but he was, in many ways, the greatest showman. And at that time, you're just beginning to get the start of mass media. You have national newspapers or regional newspapers that cover the country in the United States. You have railroads opening up the country. You have steamboats. So for the first time ever, it's possible to create fame on a national scale across that whole huge terrain of the United States and indeed into Europe and the UK as well, which is what he succeeded in doing. Barnum himself claimed he didn't do anything that had never been done before. He just did it better and on a bigger scale. So he says here, if my puffing was more persistent, my advertising more audacious, my posters more glaring, my pictures more exaggerated, my flags more patriotic, my transparencies more brilliant, it was not because I had less scruple. I wasn't doing anything wrong, but I had more energy, far more ingenuity, and a better foundation for such promises. So sheer energy and scale and daring are an important part of what Barnum does. This is the Fiji Mermaid, which he started with. Now, you can see this is a ridiculous thing. It's a fish and I don't know what it is, a part of a monkey, I think, and a fish, and they're very badly glued together. He toured this around the United States, and of course all the newspapers wrote about it, and people queued up to see it. And most people thought, this is ridiculous, this is a fake. So then they argued about it. So he loved controversy. It gave people things to talk about. Is this real or is it not? Barnum really actually likes people to doubt if it's real or not because they're going to spend more time arguing about it. He would have loved the internet. He would have loved social media. But honestly, he was doing all this stuff nearly 200 years ago. He also owned museums in New York like this. He bought the circus and he bought Jumbo the elephant from the London Zoo for a large sum of money, which it also created huge news stories. Throughout his life, he had this knack of just knowing what to do that would get famous and would get talked about. As I say, if you have seen The Greatest Showman, it's almost entirely bunk, but one bit that's sort of true is that he did have a critic who disliked him, who accused him of being a humbug, which in those days was quite a rude word that meant you were a bit of a fraud, a cheat. And Barnum, instead of saying, "Oh, no, I'm not a humbug," he did what he did in the film. He said, "I am not a humbug, I am the prince of humbugs." And he then went on to redefine what he meant by humbug. So he said, what humbug is first of all, you attract the public by din and tinsel, by brilliant skyrockets and Bengola lights, whatever they are. I imagine they're like this picture. Then you give people as much as possible for their money. And an honest man who thus arrests public attention will be called a humbug, but he is not a swindler or an imposter. So he redefined this word humbug in a way that meant, don't take it that seriously, but it's not actually cheating. It's all about simply getting talked about and making people want to be part of something. And then, as long as they get their money's worth, they won't complain. Now, why am I talking so much about P.T. Barnum? Because I think Barnum forms the basis for what happens in the generation after Barnum, which is really the growth of mass market brands. Because those early brands follow almost exactly the Barnum playbook, with the addition of a great deal of paid-for advertising because they can afford to do it. So brands like Coca-Cola, brands like Quaker Oats, which develop in the 1880s, the 1890s, or Sunlight Soap, as we've seen earlier, they do exactly what Barnum does. They basically get famous and they produce things that people want to be a part of, things that people will find intriguing, entertaining, compelling in some way. So, for example, if you take Quaker Oats, prior to the invention of the Quaker Oats brand, oats were sold like this. You went to the grocers, you got them out of a barrel. It was a total commodity. The commodity market was dominated by whoever was the biggest and could therefore buy them the cheapest. They were dominated by this guy, Fritz Schumacher, indeed, at the time, who was known as the Oat King. But then his role became supplanted during the 1890s or so by another man who was also part of the same concern originally, a man called Henry Parsons Crowell. Crowell started selling oats in a completely different way. He had them pre-packed. He put them in a nice coloured box of the sort that you can see here. He already had a sort of a logo, a device, if you like, which was described as a man in Quaker garb, hence the name. And he used all the techniques of Barnum in order to promote it. He would have trains going across the United States with a larger-than-life-size figure of the Quaker man standing on the engine. He would have ex-circus performers going door to door and giving things away. He would sponsor all sorts of promotions and stunts and goodness knows what. It's all described in some detail in the book, and I won't go into any more detail now. But one reason that Quaker Oats is interesting is because this famous quote comes from his successor, the John Stewart, who was president of the Quaker Oats Company from 1920s onwards. And this is a famous quote you may have come across. If this business were to be split up, I would be glad to take the brand's trademarks and goodwill, and you could have all the bricks and mortar, and I would fare better than you. So what Crowell has done is he's transformed the commodity market, where basically whoever can sell it cheapest wins, to a market where whoever has the most famous brand wins, and that brand was Quaker Oats. And of course, because it's now that way round, Quaker Oats can be a great deal more profitable. It can be profitable enough to invest large sums of money in advertising. By 1900, Crowell was spending $500,000 a year on advertising. That's a phenomenal sum of money when you think about it. Similar things were happening on the other side of the Atlantic. William Hesketh Lever, the founder of what became Lever Brothers and eventually Unilever, was the man behind this sunlight soap phenomenon. And again, he was doing all sorts of things. He was doing beautiful posters based on famous paintings. He had a sunlight yearbook that was given away free if you sent in enough sunlight soap wrappers. He would sponsor things that we would now call cause-related marketing. He would sponsor, he said, ask people to vote for which charity would you like me to support. They voted for the Royal National Lifeboat Institution. He then paid for a new lifeboat, which he called Sunlight One, and ensured that he had pictures of it appearing in all the newspapers. You can see how this is a very different sort of mindset for creating brands from everything we were talking about underneath the heading of salesmanship. Now, I think there are other old traditions as well that are also equally important that go back before 1900. Another of them is what we now remember as the travelling medicine show. This has a fascinating history. And again, before the advent of mass media like radio and television, there was a huge appetite for entertainment. So troops of travelling entertainers would travel round from one town to another. They'd erect the stage and they'd put on a show which was a combination of song, dance, low comedy, whatever. And the people of the town would all come out to watch. And so they'd watch the show, and then halfway through, the salesman, as you see here, would get up on stage and he'd say, and now I'm going to tell you about so-and-so's Indian tonic, which will cure all your diseases. And of course, it's an age of completely unregulated quack medicines, some of which would perhaps give us the horrors today because they contained alcohol or opium or whatever, goodness knows what. On the other hand, they probably weren't much more harmful, if at all, than what the medical profession itself was offering in those days, so it's maybe not as bad as it sounds. But here, I think you can already see a model of the selling is made possible by the entertainment. And it's made possible by the entertainment not just because the entertainment has attracted the audience, although that's obviously important, but it's done something else. It's got the audience on its side. It's put them in a good mood. It's made them want to buy something. And this is a tradition that goes back actually hundreds of years. I mean, things like the medicine show were going on in continental Europe, in places like Venice back in the 15th and 16th century. And perhaps even before that, you go back to the idea of the travelling peddler, who was somebody who would walk around selling whatever, selling ribbons or haberdashery, something like he's selling here. But he would ingratiate himself by singing or telling jokes or doing some sort of a performance. You see, this is recorded, for example, this is a quote from a play by Shakespeare, where a peddler comes to the door and the servant is running up and saying, "Oh, master, if you did but hear this peddler at the door, you'd never dance again after a tabor and pipe." He sings several tunes fast and he'll tell money. And the master says, "Prithee, bring him in and let him approach singing." So the idea is that peddlers decided many, many centuries ago that actually, if I can sing, I could go around singing and then just passing around the hat. But if I can sing and I actually go around having something to sell, then I can monetize my singing a whole lot better, to use a very modern phrase, but deliberately so. So, whether it was that the singers first decided they could make more money by selling things, Or the people who were trying to sell things realized they could sell more if they sang. It doesn't matter. They both discovered this. And that is the short answer to why does the peddler sing. The long answer, of course, is in the book. So, showmanship, as I say, large traditions going back much further than the salesmanship traditions. And in modern terms, what showmanship is doing is something quite different from the salesmanship tradition. It's first of all building what we sometimes now call mental availability or salience or fame. It's not just doing that, it's also creating positive feelings, positive affect, as psychologists like to say. And so it's making people know about your product, it's making people like your brand, and it has therefore a bias not so much towards information, although that may be a part of what it's doing, but the bias is towards entertainment. And also, the other big difference is showmanship tends to work within a social context. It's not just a one-to-one communication, it's a one-to-the-world communication. When Barnum is promoting Jenny Lind, he is not just promoting it to individuals, he is promoting it to society as a whole, and he wants society as a whole to respond to it. And that has huge implications. It means all sorts of things start happening. Social diffusion, people will talk about it and share it. Social proof, people see that other people are doing it and they think, I want some of that too. Scarcity principle. Oh, there may not be enough to go round. I'd better get in quick before it's all sought out. Conformity. Oh, I don't want to be left out. I want to be part of this. Common knowledge. It's not just a question of I know and you know, but I know that you know and you know that I know. And there's a lot of theory now that shows that people behave very differently when that is true. And overall, what we could call building a shared cultural frame of reference. That, the whole idea of what is fashionable, what is cool, what is attractive, what is desirable is created by this showmanship performance. So let's unpack a couple of those a little bit more. Claude Hopkins said in his book, the only purpose of advertising is to make sales. It is not to keep your name before the people. It is not primarily to aid your other salesmen. Treat it as a salesman, force it to justify itself. So he's literally just saying, all it should do is this one-to-one, I'm going to sell you something. He doesn't say why it's not all these things, because actually, as I hope we've begun to see, from the very earliest times, advertising has been precisely about keeping your name before the people. You see lots of ads like this all around Europe, I'm sure. Names just painted on walls, keeping your name before the people. And, of course, what we should now appreciate is that rather than being an ancient idea which Claude Hopkins could somehow sneer at as being old-fashioned and primitive, we now, at least if we are prepared to give any credence to somebody like Byron Sharp in his book, How Brands Grow, the idea that mental availability, or what he has called mere publicity, might be important, it seems to be backed up by a certain degree of science. So, if you've read How Brands Grow, and I think most people in marketing or advertising nowadays have, and if you haven't, you will probably want to, this concept of mental availability, which I rather think our first talk today was largely about as well, is in fact very, very important. You don't buy brand A rather than brand B because you think it's got this and that one hasn't. You simply buy it because it's the one you think about more readily in more situations. And in some ways, it is just as simple as that. Byron Sharp and Ehrenberg Bass have also talked a great deal about why figures like this, who we looked at earlier, make sense because they are what they call distinctive assets, or others have called fluent devices. These are things that create the distinctiveness that is crucial to mental availability. You know that bottle can only be Coca-Cola. You know that is the Pillsbury Doughboy. You know that is the Nike swoosh. You don't even have to think about it. You know that is Ronald McDonald. Those figures are incredibly powerful and incredibly valuable because they create the distinctiveness. What Byron Sharp and his colleagues don't talk about so much, although I think they touch on it, is what makes those not just distinctive, but actually appealing so that we want to engage with them. And this is where I think we come back to the ad that I showed you earlier and the sort of advertising that we used to do back in the 1970s and 80s at BMP. It was about creating characters. It was about creating entertainment. So much of it involved humor, it involved parody, it involved song and dance, it involved entertainment of one sort or another. And I think that was not by accident. This is my first boss, Martin Bowes. He's the Bowes of Bowes Massimi Pollitt. Lovely man, I'm glad to say, still alive today in his 90s, fueled by a bottle of whiskey a week, he assures me. And he said this to me when I started in advertising 50 years ago. He said something like this: we believe if you're going to invite yourself into someone's living room, you have a duty not to shout at them or bore them or insult their intelligence. On the other hand, if you're a charming guest and you entertain them or amuse them or tell them something interesting, then they may like you a bit better, and then they may be more inclined to buy your brand. Now, at the time I thought, oh, dear old Martin, that sounds so nice, but it doesn't sound like anything that we've ever heard about advertising. I now think he was absolutely right, and I think there's a great deal of theory and evidence that would back up exactly why he is right. I need to finish with a few thoughts on the subject of fame, which I've talked about. It's clearly closely related to the whole area of showmanship, but I think it's worth saying a few words about fame specifically. Let me lead into it this way. Here's a quote from Victoria Beckham, otherwise formerly known as Posh Spice of the Spice Girls. In her autobiography that was written now 25 years ago, actually, so an earlier part of her life, there's a quote: "Right from the beginning, I said I wanted to be more famous than Persil Automatic." And that's probably a familiar brand name, but in case it's not, that is the leading brand of, detergent in the UK. So another man I hugely admired in advertising, sadly no longer with us, Jeremy Bullmore of J. Walter Thompson, wrote a paper about this soon after that book came out. And he said, it was very astute of the young Posh Spice to choose not Robbie Williams, nor Sir Cliff Richard, nor Madonna as her benchmark of fame, but the country's best-known washing powder. Because just about the only thing that successful brands have in common is a kind of fame. Now, I've gone through my career finding that Jeremy always said what I wanted to say earlier than I did, and usually better, so I'm proud to quote him here. But let me talk a bit about what I mean when I talk about fame. First of all, I'd like to say that fame is much more than just mental availability, although mental availability, as measured by Ehrenberg Bass, for example, I think is very much a symptom of it and a sign of it. It may even be a good measurable proxy for it. But mental availability is fundamentally based on a model of individual psychological response. In my mind, this brand is more available than that brand. Fame is social. Fame is something that happens in society. Fame is not just we all happen to know about this brand. Fame is we all know that we all know about this brand, and we all have things that we want to share about this brand, and we all engage with this brand in a social way. And that's what Barnum understood, and that's what I think the kind of advertising that we used to do and that Susie represents does. It gets people talking about it. It gets people engaged with it. So salesmanship models, as I say, are one-to-one. Showmanship is a social model. I think that social model, which is also incidentally the way PR gurus have always operated, is actually probably much more important in creating large brands at least. And fame is powerful because, as also Jeremy Bullmore goes on to say somewhere, we are actually attracted to things that are famous. We're attracted partly because we're attracted by things that are familiar. We're attracted because things that are well known have a degree of what Robert Cialdini calls social proof. You know, everybody else likes it. It can't be bad. And this phenomenon of common knowledge. We all know about this. And then a really obvious point, but it needs stressing. I mean, fame is about the more millions of people who know about you, the more famous you are. And actually, the more millions of people who know about you, the more you can sell. It's about scale. The whole phenomenon of brands, Nike, Apple, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Lidl, they're about scale. You know, they're not just selling to a room full of people. They're not just selling to a few people. They're selling to, well, preferably everybody. And then the last point about fame is that fame, a bit like money or other types of power, once you have some fame, you can use that to create more fame. Or indeed, you can use other people's fame to piggyback your own fame. So if you want to be associated with a particular brand, as a celebrity, that may help your fame as a celebrity. There's a synergy, there's a symbiosis that goes on where one famous thing or person can support another famous thing or person. And fame in that way grows and sustains itself. I'm drawing to a conclusion. I'm just going to end with these 4 facets of fame and say what they are. The full detail of them is spelt out in 4 separate chapters in the book, Why Does the Peddler Sing? But I was thinking, can one come up with a formula for fame? And on the whole, no, you can't, because fame is not something where you go, we're going to do this and it's going to work. It's an iterative process which requires responsiveness, it requires energy, it requires dedication, and it probably requires a little bit of luck as well, as Richard was saying at the start of the day. However, I think you can set out some sort of a template that says, unless you're thinking about all these 4 things, you're very unlikely to achieve fame. And they may sound obvious, but I think they are not always to be taken for granted. So first of all, you want something which I've called very broadly compelling content. You want something that people like, something that people are going to want, something that people will enjoy or find intriguing in some way. And that's why, entertainment is hugely important. But it can also be news value, it can be novelty, it can be grotesqueness, it can be whatever people want to be a part of. But that's the start of it, but it's not enough. Because you can have that, you can have a wonderful song, and it will never be a hit, because it doesn't have the other things. You've then got to have mass coverage. And I think also a degree of repetition. You've got to get to a huge audience. It's not just enough to put it out there and hope that people will pick it up. If you want fame, the thing that will increase your chances more than anything is making sure that you have a mass audience experience. It needs to be, if not on a mass media that you're paying for like a Super Bowl, it needs to be at least picked up by somebody who has 3 billion followers and repeated by them. These things matter. Thirdly, it needs to be distinctive. People need to be able to not mistake it for anything else. You can have the first two, and if people are confusing it with something else, you quickly lose out to whoever has a little bit more energy than you do. Fourthly, fame only really, I think, creates fame in the sense of like a fire that has started that cannot be put out, with the active participation of the public. People need to engage with it, and they need to share it. As I explain in the book, fame, the English word, and I can't answer for the sláva or any other language, but it may be the same for all I know. Fame, the English word, comes from the Latin word fama, which originally meant something like word of mouth. So fame is something that people share. It is not just something that is imposed on everybody. So, one thing is further required, and I think that is what I've called a fame mindset. So if you want to make your brand famous, I think this is what is needed. Advertisers and their agencies need to think much more consciously like entertainers, like impresarios. They need to accept that entertainment is not a dirty word. And they need to think less like lawyers and think about the logic of their argument or the compelling, persuasive language. So that means they need to embrace these difficult things like aesthetics or simplicity. They need to be able to improvise and respond to what's going on in the world. They need to be prepared to make bold gestures and see what happens. And that involves a degree of risk, although it only has to be a calculated risk, and it doesn't have to be a stupid risk. In short, they need to be more Barnum. That's why I think he's such an important and iconic figure. That doesn't mean that strategy or consumer understanding or research are not important. They're actually very important because this is all about popularity. This is all about getting feedback from the public so that you know what to do next. However, that sounds easy. In my experience, too many people in advertising agencies and also on the client side do find this far from easy. Perhaps understandably, as they've all been told for the last 120 years that this is silly and irrelevant and trivial and that they should concentrate on delivering a sales message. But I think a lot of people are beginning to get it. It sounds as if quite a few people in Slovakia are beginning to get it. Dédalés certainly got it, and perhaps we'll hear about some more as the day goes on today. At that point, I'm going to stop. And as I say, the Peddler book is available. This is where the sales pitch. The Peddler book is available. This is also available, but you have to order it. It should be quite easy to get. And you can get it as an audio book if you like it, or an e-book as well. But I happen to have 2 copies here, which I don't want to take back to London with me. So I am going to offer each of these 2 copies to the first 2 people who ask me an interesting question. Over to you. You may applaud. Thank you.